So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Quach from St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. So Hung is the Director of Haematology Clinical Trials at St Vincent's, and she's a consultant laboratory and clinical haematologist. A star in clinical trials here in Melbourne, and Hung gives her apologies because she has to unfortunately leave soon after her presentation, but she's one of our clinical trial stars, and Hung, we look forward to your wisdom tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Grant, and thank you to all the organisers for this very kind invitation to make an introductory talk on clinical trials, a topic really close to my heart because as a clinician, clinical trials is currently not only the cornerstone but an integral component in everyday medicine, in particularly cancer care. So much so that clinical trials is now incorporated into part of the recommended algorithm of treatment in cancer. So, in fact, if you look at, for example, our national guideline on the treatment of multiple myeloma, which is one of the blood cancers very common in Australia, or any other international guideline in cancer care in general, oftentimes you will see that one of the first path in the algorithm, in the recommended algorithm, is for patient to be enrolled in a clinical trial if an appropriate one is available. And in fact, in our national multiple myeloma guideline, it's only if there is no appropriate clinical trials is the patient recommended to be treated as part of standard of care. And because of that, I think it's really important for patients and family members and members of the community to understand exactly what clinical trials are all about, to avoid any misconception that may impact on the choice of optimal management for the particular individual. So what is a clinical trial? So clinical trials are basically any research that are done on humans to assess the impact on health outcome from a particular intervention. And that intervention can be anything from a treatment, such as drugs or a surgical intervention or a new process of care or a behavioural treatment. Or it could range from a technique or a strategy to prevent a particular disease, or indeed just a biochemical test to prevent or screen or early detection in cancers, or intervention to improve quality of life. And the health outcome can range from anything from safety to that intervention, effectiveness, quality of life, and so on. But the ultimate aim of a clinical trial is, number one, to improve the outcome for patients, and in a broader sense, to improve clinical practice, and on an even broader sense, to lift up the standard of care of medicine in general for the community. So that's some of the reason why clinical trials are important, but the crux of it all is that, as Grant just mentioned, clinical trials is the only portal by which the amazing discoveries in the lab that is done by all our unsung heroes, and they're the scientists, can be translated into actual benefit in the clinic, which is where it ultimately matters. And for me as a clinician, not only are there scientific value to this, but at a practical level, sometimes clinical trials is the only way for me to offer an option or hope for patients in whom there are none otherwise. And at an even more practical level, sometimes clinical trials is the only way for me to access proven drugs, effective drugs, but which are not available in Australia because they are not reimbursed on the PBS, and that's just at a practical level. And so on that note, I just want to briefly explain the place of clinical trials in context within our health system, so you have a bit of a framework and you understand what I'm on about when I talk about the TGA and the PBS, etc. So in Australia, as you know, we're very lucky to have a national healthcare system that ensures equitable access to healthcare and drugs for everyone, regardless of our private health fund status. And so the two important components of our healthcare system is the Medicare and the PBS. And Medicare is a publicly funded program that ensures equitable access to health services at little or no cost. And the PBS provides subsidised prescription drugs to all Australians. So when a drug is said to be PBS reimbursed, it means that it's largely paid for and we can actually access it at little or no cost. But before a drug can be considered for reimbursement on the PBS, it must first be approved and registered by our national regulatory agency, that's the TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration. And the role of the TGA is to make sure that all therapeutic goods that are in Australia that are available to the public meets a certain standard. Now, even before a drug can be registered on the TGA, it must first undergo a series of rigorous testing. They are clinical trials, which is the focus for today. And only when a drug is proven to be effective and safe can the pharmaceutical companies are able to apply for it to be registered in various regulatory bodies in different countries. And usually they go first to the US, so that's the FDA, Food Drug Administration, or Europe, that's the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, before they reach the TGA, the Australian TGA. So we're always a bit behind when it comes to access in new drugs. And so now it may take, of the thousands of agents that begin at this level, so I'm just going to go back here, of the thousands of agents that starts off here, perhaps only one or two is chosen to be developed into clinical treatment, so undergo clinical trials, of which only about 20% actually gets registered and a lesser percent become reimbursed for patient use. So it can take around 10 to 20 years for this to happen from the time that the drug starts off in the laboratory to the time that it's available for public use. Now, some of my patients, some people I speak to automatically assumes that just because you're in a clinical trial, it means that you're a guinea pig. So I just want to take one slide to explain the phases of clinical trials to clarify this matter. So the degree of guinea pigness or degree of uncertainty of whether or not a drug works depends on which stage of the clinical trials the drug has reached. So just very briefly, all new drug has to undergo first pre-clinical testing, and that's testing in animals or in cells to make sure that it works. And once it looks promising, they then go ahead towards phase 1 human studies. And the focus of phase 1 human studies is mainly safety. So to look at to find the safest dose, the safest mode of delivery, and the safest schedule. And once that's determined, the drug then proceeds to phase 2 studies, whereby the focus here is to look at the preliminary efficacy in a more focused group of patients, a group of patients with particular cancers, for example, and then to look at more about expanded safety. By the time the drug reaches phase 3 clinical trials, we know that the drug works, we know that it's safe, we want to know now whether it's better compared to our current standard of care. And so often phase 3 trials involves randomisation, hundreds up to thousands of patients, randomised to 2 arms, the investigational arm and the control arm. And the control arm usually represents the current standard of care. And if indeed the investigational agent is better than the current standard of care, then in the best circumstances it ought to be the new standard of care. And that's how we lift the standards of care for all our patients. So all that's well and good, but what does it mean for you? What about the patient journey perspective? So I've got a bit of a sore throat. So I can tell you it's not as straightforward as this. You're eligible for clinical trials, just sign here and let's go. Although I can tell you that a number of my elderly patients prefers it that way. The number of times I get patients saying, "Doctor, I trust you implicitly, just give it to me and I'll sign. No need to read, no need to read." It doesn't work that way. I think the consent process is probably one of the most important process in a clinical trial. You have to know what's being done to you, why it's being done to you, and what are the alternatives. And in fact, before any clinical trials can be executed in any institution, the protocol has to first undergo a rigorous process of review by the Institutional Ethics Committee. And only when it satisfies the national and institutional ethical standard will it be allowed to be executed. So, what constitutes as an ethical standard? I've got a number of clinical trials at the moment whereby one of the arms is a placebo arm, a sugar pill arm. And so my patients appropriately ask me, well, how is that ethical, doctor? You're giving me a sugar pill. Well, in fact, the ethical basis of clinical research in human rests on a principle called equipoise, and this is really important. Equipoise is a true state of uncertainty of whether or not the investigational agent is better than the control arm. And the control arm, as I said, usually represents the current standard of care. And if the current standard of care is to do nothing, then it would be appropriate to use a placebo pill or a sugar pill to represent that nothing. Now, the problem is that different clinicians have different threshold in believing whether or not the investigational agent works and how well it works. And rightfully or wrongfully, we impart that onto our patient. But just because I believe the drug to be effective doesn't mean it is. Because at this point in time, it's not proven. There's still equipoise, and that's why we're doing the clinical trial. Now, halfway through the clinical trial, if at an interim analysis it is found that arm A is better than arm B, then surely it's unethical to continue the trial. We have to stop the trial and recommend that the superior arm becomes standard of care and, if possible, allow patients to cross over. Okay? Now, I'll just give you an example of a current example of how a placebo or a number of placebo-controlled trials has basically lifted up the standard of care in cancer. And I keep referring to myeloma because that's my baby. I subspecialise in multiple myeloma. So multiple myeloma is an incurable blood cancer. The current standard of care of treatment of multiple myeloma is to allow patients to have upfront autologous stem cell transplant as part of their initial treatment. Now, up until a decade ago, it is common practice to do nothing after autologous stem cell transplant. We transplant patients and we leave them alone. That's it. And then up until a number of clinical trials were established to ask the question, is it better to continue patients on maintenance therapy after the transplant versus doing nothing like what we were doing then? And so a number of clinical trials were established, and these trials basically randomised patients to placebo, which was acceptable back then, or lenalidomide, which is a maintenance therapy, just a tablet. And it turned out that continuing patients on treatment in a maintenance fashion does indeed delay disease progression, so improve progression-free survival. Improve progression-free survival, so that's the red line there, the patient on lenalidomide versus placebo, and in turn improves overall survival. And because of this, it is now the current standard of care for patients to receive maintenance therapy post-autologous stem cell transplant around the world. Now, if at the moment there is a new drug, which there is, that claims to be even better for maintenance therapy, it is no longer ethical to compare that drug to placebo, because the current standard of care is something. So we have to compare that drug to the current something, which is lenalidomide elsewhere, or in the case of Australia, thalidomide. Does that make sense? Okay, now back to the patient journey. So what is involved in the clinical trial? You can see here that even before a patient is recruited, there are a number of steps that must be followed. So it's not as straightforward as sign here and let's go. So even before a doctor introduces you to a clinical trial, he or she would have done his homework to see which trial benefits you and whether or not you're likely going to be eligible for a particular trial before introducing it to you in the clinic. But at that introduction in the clinic, perhaps some of the more pertinent questions that you could ask, or I would encourage all my patients to ask, is, well, how will this trial benefit me, doctor? Now, is it a phase 1, 2 or 3 clinical trial? Just to gauge in your mind how far along the developmental process is the drug, right? What are the expected side effects? So that's a common question. What are the frequency of the visits? Just practical questions. Am I going to be able to cope with all the visits that's demanded? Will I be reimbursed for my travel? Very practical. And importantly, if I choose not to participate in this clinical trial, what are the alternative options? It's very important for you to understand the alternative options. And so the doctor normally gives you then a patient information and consent form, and usually this is a document that contains all this information about the clinical trial. Unfortunately, most PICF is about 20 pages long, so I don't know how patients read it. I can't even read it. But you don't have to read it all at once. You take it home, you read it, you write all over it, you highlight it. It's not a Bible. You just scribble all over it, the questions. And then the whole point is that the doctor must give you enough time to read the PICF. We normally at St Vincent's give patients a week, and if treatment is more urgent, then we give patients at least 24 hours. You then come back to the clinic, and then this is a chance for you to ask more questions, having read the patient information and consent form. So you're now in a better frame of mind now to ask more questions. But what I want you to remember is that before you sign the consent, ask all questions, but just because you've signed on the consent form, it doesn't mean that you're irreversibly locked in. You have the right to withdraw from the clinical trial at any point in time if you are concerned. And if the doctor is concerned about you, he or she will have the ethical responsibility to withdraw you out of the clinical trial as well. Only once the PICF, the Patient Information Consent Form, is signed, will the research team have the ability to initiate trial-specific investigations to see whether or not you are eligible for the clinical study. Now, just because your doctor thinks you're eligible doesn't mean you're eligible. So there's a list of inclusion and exclusion criteria that has to be met, and in my experience, up to 25% of patients fail this step and not be able to enrol into the clinical trial. But if you are deemed eligible, you are then enrolled, randomised, and then the real journey begins. So the real journey begins with you as the centre and a network of research staff around you, starting with the trial coordinators. The trial coordinators will be your best friend. Now, these are the people who coordinate every step of your care throughout the trial. And at St Vincent's, the trial coordinators are responsible for booking appointments, following patients to the clinics, following patients to the treatment, ensuring that the patient's reimbursed, etc. So a lot of my patients get more attached to the trial coordinators than me. Come Christmas time, I get a present and the trial coordinators get a present. So you also get more familiar with the nursing staff who will personally deliver the treatment to you, and then you'll see your doctor, the investigator, at regular intervals. The doctor will carry out the treatment in accordance to clinical trial protocol and dose adjust according to your side effects and how you're going. Now, those are the three groups of people you come into direct contact with, but there is a whole host of people behind the scene who are also involved in your care, starting off with the scientists. Now, the scientists will not know you personally, but they will know your blood and all the biological products that you've given consent to be collected. And so the results, the data from all the blood tests and all the clinical data from your doctor visits will be collated by the data managers of the clinical trials. All the data get entered into a central data program, then gets analysed statistically. Now, once the data is mature and a conclusion is reached, that is then the data will be made known public to the scientific community, normally in the form of presentation at international scientific conferences. And so when you come to a clinic and your doctor's never there, it's because he's gone to one of these conferences, and that's the reason. And usually it's followed up by a publication in a medical journal. And only the drugs in which there is efficacy proven, safety proven, will the pharmaceutical companies can then apply for the drug to be registered by regulatory bodies, TGA in our instances, and be made available to the public. So you can see that it's only through this process that novel effective therapeutic agents can be made available to the public. And so, and multiple myeloma is a prime example that has benefited from this process and in which the standard of care has been lifted. So even though it's an incurable cancer, the survival of multiple myeloma has significantly improved throughout the last several decades, and this can be directly attributed to the new treatment as a result of clinical trials. So back in the 1990s, all we had for multiple myeloma was just chemotherapy, and the median survival back then was less than 2 years. Fast forward to the current era, the median survival of multiple myeloma is quoted to be just below 6 years, and that's due to all the new therapeutic agents that's become available. Towards the future, this is what we expect for multiple myeloma in terms of survival, and that's because there is a plethora of novel therapeutic agents that's arisen in the horizon. And so, but you see, the only way that this can be translated into this is through clinical trials. And a recent example of this is a new group of drug for multiple myeloma called monoclonal antibodies. And I just want to spend one slide on this just as an example of successful clinical trials. So we've known for a long time that our immune system is one of the most powerful tools we have against cancer. Problem is that in most cancers, our immune system cannot recognise the cancer as being foreign, can't attack it. And in multiple myeloma, for a long time, we could not wake up the immune system. That is until about 6 years ago, when the first monoclonal antibody was developed against multiple myeloma called daratumumab. And so, just briefly, monoclonal antibodies are engineered antibodies that are engineered to recognise a specific marker on cancer cells, in this case the myeloma cells. And being an antibody, they do what antibodies do, which is they can attract the host, the patient's own immune effector cells, such as natural killer cells, which upon being in close proximity to the cancer cells can now recognise it and kill it. And so when daratumumab was first trialled in phase 1 clinical study, now remember how I said that phase 1 is only about safety. People were really surprised because they found a significant efficacy signal in that in a group of patients with a median 5 prior lines of treatment, or up to 14 in some cases, in whom you would expect a survival of about 6 to 9 months only, they saw a response rate in phase 1 trial of about 30% and the median survival of about 20 months. So these people were living twice as long as they should be. And so because of that, this drug then received a breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA to expedite it through clinical trials so it could be made available to the public. And since then, this drug has gone through a number of clinical trials in combination with the current backbone of standard of care, so DARA in combination with lenalidomide and dexamethasone, or DARA together with bortezomib and dexamethasone, compared to the current backbone on its own. And you can see in both cases, the combination of DARA with the backbone here and here is better than the backbone on its own. And so this photo is of a patient of mine who had directly benefited from one of the aforementioned trials. So this photo was published in one of the St. Vincent newsletter article. So when she had relapsed myeloma that many years ago, she was in a lot of trouble, had no other treatment options, and was in dire strait. But this is 3.5 years on. She's still in ongoing complete remission. She's still on the clinical trial, receiving DARA once a month as a maintenance therapy, even though the trial has long closed. She's had excellent quality of life and won't come off the trial. So she's quite happy there. So finally, what could be done better? I think there's now an increasing recognition for the need of clinical trials in Australia and worldwide. And I think we've come a long way in Australia in a short period of time. But there are a number of things that could be done better, and I'm just going to briefly mention a few. First is, of course, increasing public awareness of the role of clinical trials, which is what we're doing here today, which is fantastic. One of the most important area of need that I see for Australia is the need for equitable access to novel therapeutic agents on clinical trials for patients in remote country areas. And so a lot of the clinical trials at the moment is run in tertiary centres in the city and some in metropolitan areas, but a lot of my patients in the country can't access these clinical trials because of the cost of travel and the logistics of distance. So we, as a country, need to do more to bring trials to these patients, i.e. improve the infrastructure in the remote areas or improve the services there in the long term, but at least in the short term, provide funding for these patients to come to the city to access these clinical trials. On a broader level, we need to establish clinical studies with regional relevance. And by that, I mean studies in which the results can be directly applicable to Australia. At the moment, the majority of, I wouldn't say, well, it is the majority, a significant proportion of clinical trials that we do are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. And that's because they own the drug. But because they're sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, they are designed to answer questions that are more pertinent to the interest of pharmaceutical companies. And sometimes the results cannot be directly applicable to Australia or the Asia-Pacific region in general, simply because the combination of the proposed drugs is simply too expensive. And so I think there's a significant need, a strong need to increase independent funding in Australia to allow investigator-initiated clinical trials. And these are trials that are initiated by us and not pharma, to ask the questions that are specific to our need and which can be applied to our healthcare system. And that's quite crucial. So I'm going to end there in the interest of time and leave you with this image. The road will not always be that pretty, but sometimes you just have to keep walking. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now, Just before you go, I do want to ask you a question before you depart. So, one of the really interesting things about all the data around clinical trials is that patients that participate in cancer clinical trials have better survival than patients who do not take part in a clinical trial. Why might that be?
There are a number of reasons. In fact, I have patients who actually a number of patients at St Vincent's who keeps wanting to be enrolled in the clinical trial because they think they get better care, which is probably true. There are two reasons. In clinical trials, the doctors, from a medical point of view, the doctors have to follow a specific protocol-driven way in how to manage patients. So the patients are reviewed on a regular basis. The patients are given a chance to articulate their side effects more to the doctors. The doctors are mandated to respond to those side effects by dose reductions or increasing in supportive care. So there's more of an interaction, more regimented interactions between doctors and patients. So that's from a medical point of view. From a psychological point of view, I think a lot of patients feel, and this is just my personal experience, more involved in clinical trials. They are more empowered in clinical trials because they know exactly what's going on, when it's going to happen, and they know what to anticipate compared to your average patient in the clinic whereby, they see different doctors at different times. Despite the best attempt from the doctor's point of view, some patients may not know all the information they need to know about their treatment and they feel very insecure. So there's a psychological component, there is a medical component, and in depending on the trials that you're on, the treatment on the clinical trials are often cutting edge type of treatment that we can't access here on the PBS.
Great, well thanks very much, and here's a small gift.
Oh, that's
Thank
lovely.
you for your
Thank you.
great talk tonight.